What's up guys, and welcome to today's video. Today I'm going to be going through how I'm actively turning constraints into creative fuel for Killer Chaos OS. And like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models, and how I'm scaling those mental models into the future. Also just to solve what hurts, basically to come into businesses and organizations and to be the chief problem solvers and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure for those businesses. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people aligned with the mission of what it is that we're actively building, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So like always, how I like to do this is broken down into 5 simple steps of how I'm turning constraints into innovation for my vision of Killer Chaos OS, which is super important. And I think this one's going to be a fun one, to be honest with you. So let's just dive straight into it. So number one being embrace the limit. It's your starting line. Ultimately saying why this matters is constraints aren't blockers, they're blueprints. Ultimately blueprints to show you that, hey, this is how we need to solve XYZ, because with those blueprints you're ultimately able to solve the constraints that you have and ultimately build better products. And saying, hey, not having a team or budget, you don't have a team or budget within your business, ultimately saying that's an edge, not an excuse. Basically turning all the constraints of what is going on, what you think are constraints, into what can you use to win. Ultimately saying, hey, this is actually an edge, to say that we don't have a budget, we don't have a team, and this is our competitive edge and we can leverage that. Basically turning those constraints into leverage and saying, hey, this is not the limit, this is our starting line. Always pushing the boundaries. And then saying, hey, how I'm actively doing this is saying limited dev hours made me laser focused on predictive alerts. So saying, hey, instead of having our devs working XYZ hours more than they should, it ultimately just led me to being super laser focused on building the predictive alerts that we are building internally for our clients and also for ourselves that we're actively implementing. And ultimately saying, hey, that one feature became the heart of Killer Chaos OS. As we're still building it out, we're still just gathering data points for ultimately just understanding that, hey, we need to make sure that we're building predictive analysis like XYZ, and ultimately just use those data points in order to get feedback and ultimately scale that feedback. But just getting those data points are ultimately what is going to drive what it is that we're building in terms of Killer Chaos OS, but ultimately also focusing on the constraints, because the constraints are the starting lines and not the limit. Basically saying, hey, we need to make sure that we just have a positive outlook. We know that, hey, this is going to be bad, the constraints, we only move as fast as our constraints, but how can we then turn those constraints into leverage and ultimately just push the needle forward each and every single day. And saying, hey, what's the daily move that I could make each and every single day, which is pick one constraint that you're facing. Hey, are you facing product builds being slow? Is it just your internal systems not being up to scratch? Do you have a leaky system in terms of client acquisition? And then ultimately asking the question of saying, hey, how can I sharpen my focus on this specific aspect of my internal business or external when you're building client projects, and ultimately just turn those constraints to ultimately dial in your focus, making sure that each and every single day you're just sharpening the tool stack that you have, and also just ultimately sharpening the focus that you have in terms of product build. And then saying, hey, what is the key question from first principles that you could ask from this, which is what's one limit you could turn into a strength? So what you think are limits or constraints or bottlenecks, how can you then turn this bottleneck or constraint into a success story for yourself, ultimately turning it into the strength of yours, to say, hey, we don't have a budget, that's cool, so we have nothing to lose, so we can go swinging for the fences, ultimately just to build our case study, our portfolio, and we can make mistakes because we don't have that saying, hey, we have money to lose or we don't have a team to lose as well. You ultimately just turn those constraints into leverage and saying, hey, these are the starting points, now let's leverage that and just build better into the future, which ultimately leads to the second point, which is simplify to amplify, do less, win more, ultimately building systems and just focusing on doing a lot less in terms of manual input each and every single day, and systemizing your entire process by saying, hey, constraints force clarity, basically pointing out what it is that you need to ultimately systemize within your internal processes most of the time, that at least I found, which is ultimately saying, hey, when you can't do everything, you finally figure out what matters, ultimately saying, hey, each and every single day we realize that, hey, XYZ client knows that they can't do everything, and this is because of their manual processes. Their manual inputs are ultimately slowing them down on a day-to-day basis, all which ultimately allows us to then come in and ultimately say, hey, we need to solve this so that we can allow them to focus on what actually matters, and saying, hey, how I'm doing this is cut fluff for outreach bumped replies from 4% to 6% without adding more effort, ultimately just building a systemized template to say, hey, this is our own internal stuff that we're going to be using for these templates, and then we're ultimately just going to tweak it, and then ultimately bumping up email replies through that, and then saying, hey, what's the daily move that I could make on a day-to-day basis, which I always ask myself, which is delete or automate one low impact task this week. What is the one low impact task that I could delete or automate this week that will allow me to free up my time and focus on higher leverage work, which ultimately just allows me to push the needle forward of what we are actively building. And then saying, hey, what is the key question, which is, what's one thing you could simplify to ultimately boost your impact through systems, ultimately just allowing you to systemize your processes in order for you to then create impact that ultimately just allows you to scale into the future and just solve problems. Because the most important thing is you want to be able to focus on those high leverage tasks, but you also ultimately need to systemize and do less in terms of the manual input on a day-to-day basis, and ultimately win more. And this is a focus point that I always have when I have discussions with my clients and leads as well, to ultimately say, hey, we need to make sure that your process, we delete and just focus on what actually moves the needle, and ultimately just build around that with 2 to 3 focus points, and then ultimately just scaling those focus points into the future, and then saying, hey, hack the system, find workarounds, which is a cheat code basically. And why this matters is because you can't buy if you can't buy your way through, you can build your way forward, ultimately saying, hey, you can build your way forward even though you can't buy your way through, ultimately saying, hey, I'm doing this is not using a CRM, for example. You just rig Airtable and Zapier, then ultimately into a custom pipeline. Now I run outreach like a machine, so ultimately just running the outreach like a machine with specific strategies in place for that. Ultimately, just allowing you to say, hey, if you don't have a CRM, you can just bootstrap it. You can ultimately just bootstrap it and still get somewhat of the same result, because you still need to find workarounds. And I think ultimately, when it comes to building systems as well, finding workarounds is one of the key things that you ultimately just need to adapt to and also have a proactive approach to, because you're going to need to find workarounds, and finding those workarounds each and every single day is going to be so imperative to building. And I think just having a workaround, finding a solution based mindset ultimately just allows you to push the needle forward and get stuff done. And then ultimately saying, hey, what is the daily move that I could be making on a day-to-day basis, which is find a free or scrappy solution to one bottleneck this week. Ultimately saying, hey, if we can't find XYZ solution, let's just find a workaround that we could use, and then ultimately just use that, because it still just gets the job done. But into the future, if that workaround is not working, then we ultimately just tweak for it, but ultimately also just keeping it in mind and noting it and saying, hey, we used a scrappy solution for this, so now into the future we know that, hey, if it breaks, we need to look at this XYZ point first before you take a look at the entire system, and then ultimately just building around that, and then saying, hey, what is the key question that I could ask around this, which is, what's one workaround that could unlock your next win? Ultimately asking the question of, hey, what is the one workaround that you could build today that will ultimately unlock a win for you? And that win doesn't have to be big, it can be small as well. Ultimately understanding that, hey, we need to ultimately be a workaround finding machine, and ultimately have strategies in place for that we actively have, and ultimately just building workaround methodologies and frameworks that we're actively implementing in terms of how we find the workarounds, just ultimately just building a workaround based mindset and problem solution finding mindset as well, if that makes sense. But yeah, and then ultimately saying, hey, Number four, which is leveraging network. Constraints need collabs. No matter what you do, you're always going to need to collab with people. Ultimately, just working with people as well is ultimately just going to allow you to move to the next level. And why this matters is that when you don't have resources, you need relationships. I think in every single facet, you need relationships in people. You need to invest a lot into people, relationships, and just ultimately just understanding that you're not going to do it alone. No matter what you do, you're not going to succeed alone, and you're going to need people around you and ultimately for you to succeed. And then ultimately understanding that, hey, what I'm actively doing is I'm increasing the number of conversations that I have on a day-to-day basis, ultimately saying, hey, each and every single day I'm just going to speak to a lot of people that ultimately just allow me to understand what they're working on, also share what I'm working on, and ultimately just collab through that, because ultimately those are also as well as your resources to say, hey, these networks and relationships that I have are ultimately what's important to me, and ultimately just having them in whatever stage I believe is super important, to just have people around you that are like-minded and that are always constantly just pushing the needle and also pushing you forward, because that is super unmatched. And then saying, hey, what's the daily move that I could have today, which is send one message to someone who solved your problem, implement this the gem, ultimately just giving free resource. I think I'm a super big believer in giving, and then not asking anything in particular for return, but ultimately just giving value, because in turn you always just find a way to get that value 10x more if you just take the approach of just always giving without expecting anything back, and just ultimately helping people. I think that's super important, and just moving the needle forward by having strong relationships with people and just ultimately just building with people is super important. And I think this is one of the things that will ultimately just allow us to push the needle forward, and investing heavily in that as well. And saying, hey, what's the key question that I could ask here, which is who can help you flip a constraint into an opportunity today. Ultimately asking the question of how can you flip this XYZ constraint into an opportunity through the relationships, through people that you know, ultimately people that have solved a similar situation that you may be facing today, and ultimately that just allows you to move faster into what it is that you're doing. And ultimately, because you can ask questions and they've been through it, it ultimately just allows you to solve it much quicker, and ultimately just create those opportunities that come into the future. Well, at least I found. And then saying, hey, number five, which is super important, I like to always tie the number five with everything together, which is ultimately tying it back to the vision, because I think the vision is the most important thing to keep in mind each and every single day. And that's saying, hey, tied to the vision, constraints build legacies, ultimately saying, hey, constraints are the pressure that forges empires, ultimately saying, hey, these constraints that you're facing today, even though that they may seem tough, they're ultimately forging the empire for what it is that you're building, and you just need to move faster in solving those, and ultimately just pushing the needle forward, and ultimately saying, hey, this is what we need this is the fire that we need to get burned in order to reach the next level, and just constantly keep pushing through that, and saying, hey, how I'm doing that, whenever I hit a wall in terms of cash, resources, time, I build sharper, ultimately saying each and every day I'm going to use these constraints and ultimately just build sharper in what it is that I'm actively building, and moving closer to the vision each and every single day, because I think that is the most important thing, to just constantly just keep pushing the needle forward and reaching that vision through those constraints, because those constraints forge you into the person that you need to become in order to build that big picture vision. And I think we're going to get there. I know that we're going to get there with time. We just always just need to keep that in mind, the frame of, hey, we're building for the future, and these constraints that we're facing today are ultimately just a byproduct of what it is that we need. We just have to do it. And then ultimately saying, hey, what is the daily move that I could be making today on a day-to-day basis that I like to ask myself, which is write one constraint you're facing, and then ultimately write how it builds your big picture vision, ultimately just understanding that, hey, this constraint is ultimately building the big picture vision that we need to go through, and ultimately just allow ourselves to just build better and scale better into the future. Of course, you're gonna fail most of the time. It's not always gonna be rosy, and I do understand that, but ultimately I know that through this we ultimately just gonna tie everything back to the big picture vision, and saying, hey, how does this constraint make your vision stronger? Because I believe each and every single constraint in any shape or form ultimately makes your big picture vision stronger, and you just need to embrace that and ultimately build around that and saying, hey, this is making my vision stronger, and I need to make sure that each day on a day-to-day basis I'm building around that and scaling through that, and ultimately just saying, hey, I need to understand that and ultimately just push myself a lot more and just ultimately just push the vision a lot further into the future, and just constantly just hitting the nail. Like I always say, we're still in the trenches, just trying to figure it out, and also just building what it is that we're building today, and also just pushing the needle forward each and every single day. I know there's some things that we may be wrong in terms of thinking and thinking things through, and that's okay. It's ultimately how we learn and how we implement strategies in terms of understanding that, hey, if we fail, this is how we come back, and ultimately building around that and scaling that into the future. And that's why I'm super pumped to be building Killer Chaos OS internally into the future, and just constantly just pushing the needle forward of what I think is possible today, and then creating a new realm of possibility tomorrow. And yeah, that's basically all I wanted to share. It was pretty exciting. So yeah, and today, yeah, so this is day 45 if I'm not mistaken. We're almost halfway. I'm super excited. From day 50 we're gonna just take it up a notch, and then we're gonna push it to 100, day 100, and then ultimately just tying the vision back, reshaping industries, $100 million worth of impact, and also just also inspiring millions of people, which is the most important thing. I think I know that we're gonna get there. It's only just gonna be a matter of time. But in order to get there, we need to do the hard work, and we ultimately just need to understand what it is that we're doing now, and also scaling that into the future. So yeah, if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to like, comment what your thoughts are in the description, in the comments. Follow me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.